Come on, fire. Get out your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to episode 1 of the second season of CN Live. I'm Joe Lauria, editor-in-chief of Consortium News.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss.
Thank you for joining us for this premiere of season 2. CN Live will now be coming to you in a new format. Rather than a fixed day and time, we'll be webcasting interviews as news requires, focusing on single issues for each webcast, perhaps several times a week. Check our website and Twitter and Facebook pages to be notified of the next show, or go to the front page of our site to subscribe to our free email service with news of upcoming shows and what we're publishing at Consortium News. The in-depth format of our program, to be found almost nowhere else on the web or on broadcast television, will not change. Today we'll be probing the meaning of the U.S. assassination of Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps Commander Major General Qasem Soleimani at Baghdad Airport on Friday. Joining us to discuss the reasons behind this calamitous event, Middle East analyst Giorgio Cafiero and former UN weapons inspector in Iraq, Scott Ritter. Welcome, Scott and Giorgio, to this segment of the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Giorgio, I want to start with you. Just give our audience a background of who Qasem Soleimani is. He's clearly a major figure in the Middle East, known to anyone who knows even a little about the region. He had enormous influence. Who is he, before we talk about why the U.S. killed him?
He was the head of the Quds Force, which is an elite unit within Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. In recent months, there has been a lot of discussion about IRGC activities within Iran, as there has been oppression in the past few months. The IRGC has been involved in this clampdown at home, but we need to keep in mind right now that Soleimani was involved in Iran, but throughout the region, specifically in Iraq and Syria. This military commander is very revered among many Iranians. I visited Iran myself in early 2016, and there are many tributes to him throughout the cities that I visited in the Islamic Republic. If you talk to many Iranians, they will tell you that he is a military leader who deserves a lot of credit for not only protecting Iran, mostly protecting Iran from the ISIS threat, but also from what they see as a liberation of ISIS in large parts of Iraq and Syria. Now, let's keep in mind that he did not become a household name once ISIS came to power. He was involved in many activities in Iraq that took place after the U.S. invasion and occupation of that country beginning in 2003. The U.S. government has had major problems with him because he was able to drive many events in Iraq in ways that did not suit the objectives of the United States during those years of the occupation. And he has been considered a major enemy of the United States for years, dating back at least till the 2000s. What is important to note, and I'm sure we'll talk about in a little more depth throughout this program, is the fact that Trump's predecessors, Barack Obama and George W. Bush, saw Soleimani in many ways as a big threat to U.S. interests in the region, but the U.S., under the leadership of Obama and previously Bush, made a decision to not do exactly what the U.S. just did at the way end of last year, due to the major risks of blowback and escalation of tensions between Washington and Tehran. But now at this point, we have to deal with these consequences, however they appear, however they pan out. But the situation is very, very dangerous, not only for U.S. interests, but also the interests of many, many countries in the region, Lebanon, Kingdom of Bahrain, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, so on and so forth. I think there's going to be a lot of blowback that will take us a long time to fully realize.
Good, thank you, Georgia. We'll leave that part about the reaction of it by Iran for a little bit later. But Scott, tell us a little bit about what, two things. What role Soleimani played in defeating the Islamic State. That is never given any kind of acknowledgement in the Western, especially U.S. media. And then the second question, and you might have particular insight into this, is the media in the U.S. in particular likes to seize onto mantras, and they all repeat the same thing very quickly from the same day, it seems like, and then that becomes truth within a few days. For example, he killed hundreds of Americans. I saw David Sanger on CNN briefly yesterday, and he said it's true that he killed hundreds of Americans. I mean, you could put one of those clips together where you have a dozen people saying he killed hundreds of Americans. Now, they're making it sound like he went up there and choked them with his own bare hands, hundreds of Americans. Now, the way I see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, what they're referring to is during the occupation by the U.S. of Iraq, which, of course, the invasion, the occupation was never authorized by the UN Security Council. There was never Article 51 self-defense argument made because there was no self-defense here. So one could say this was an illegal invasion and occupation. So during this illegal occupation, any nation in the world that is occupied is going to be a form of resistance. And that Soleimani helped organize some militias to resist the American occupation, in the midst of which some Americans were killed. Is that what happened?
Well, it's even more complicated than that. I mean, look, the bottom line is, how you want to couch the legality of the American presence is irrelevant. We had a military force in Iraq. Our military force was involved in combat operations against insurgents who opposed our presence there. Now, when we first came in 2003, we were confronted by the Iraqi military. We defeated the Iraqi military, and we subsequently occupied Iraq and Baghdad. We were assisted in this effort early on by the Iranian government. We were actually allied with the Badr Brigade, which is a group of Iraqi Shia who had fled to Iran during the Iran-Iraq War and were organized and equipped and trained by the Iranian government to confront Saddam Hussein. And the Badr Brigade joined us in the combat, assisted us in facilitating contact with the Shia population, and also assisted in the early days of forming a government to replace Saddam Hussein and the Baathists when they were overthrown. Our problem was that we did not necessarily want the Shia to be in charge. We had handpicked our own individual to take over, a former Baathist, and with CIA connections, by the way. And this was opposed. And initially the fight was political, and the Iranians were encouraging a political solution. But when the United States sought to shut down some of the Shia politicians, and in particular Muqtada al-Sadr, an Iraqi Shia, the son of a very venerated Muslim scholar, his supporters rose up and started fighting the United States. And this led to a broader resistance, anti-American resistance among the Shia. And at this point in time, the Iranians had to make a decision on what to do. Now, the irony is they could have chosen full-scale conflict. They didn't. The Iranians kept pushing for a political solution, but they understood the best way to get to a political solution was to convince the Americans that they could not win a protracted military fight against the Shia insurgency. In order to do this, you had to transition the Shia insurgency away from being street fighters into being something that was more lethal to the American occupiers. And this is where Qasem Soleimani came in. He and his Quds Force came in, helped facilitate training, arming, and the provision of munitions designed to defeat a heavily mechanized American occupation force. They did this through something called the EFP, the Explosively Formed Projectile, a special kind of improvised explosive device, a road bomb. It was designed to use a shape charge to penetrate armor on tanks and armored fighting vehicles and inflict casualties. Now, this is where, when you have people come in and say Soleimani is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans, this is what they're talking about, the employment of EFPs. But what I find, first of all, it's a factually incorrect number, hundreds. The Shia were not the only ones using EFPs. There were factories in Baghdad where the Sunni insurgents were using EFPs. They used them very effectively. And not all EFPs came from Iraq. Many of them were indigenously produced by the Shia. It's not a complex technology. I went through training in the military on how to make EFPs using improvised devices you find in a farm. So it's not high tech. It's just very efficient, very lethal. But this is the curiosity. For those who scream, he murdered Americans. What does that say about the United States when we provided Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen to shoot down Soviet airplanes in Afghanistan in the 1980s, thereby turning the tide of battle there? I have met with Soviet fighting men who fought in Afghanistan, who were on the receiving end of that technology. They don't sit there and scream about how Americans have blood on their hands because they recognize that it was a war. And that's what happens in war. People die in war. And so now we're in Iraq, we're at war with Shia insurgents who are employing a technology that is killing American tanks, and we're crying that people got killed. What did we expect to happen? This is an absolutely ludicrous charge levied against Qasem Soleimani. He did nothing different than what we did in Afghanistan against the Soviets. We call him a terrorist and a murderer, and we call our people heroes.
Well, that's quite interesting. That's exactly right. And it all begs the question, what are American soldiers doing over there thousands of miles from U.S. soil? They just happen to be there. They're killing Americans, but the Americans went there in an invasion that was really the cause of all of this, isn't it, Scott?
Right, but again, I'm looking at this from a military standpoint. I mean, the one question is a political question. I agree. Politically, we should never have been there. But God bless the American soldier who enlisted, went in the military, and now has to deploy where he's told to deploy and do a task that he is told to do. He's told to close with and destroy the enemy through firepower and maneuver and repel enemy counterattacks with close combat. That's his mission. And so he's out there trying to do that, and the enemy's doing it better to him than he's doing it to him. That's what war is about. It's kill or be killed. You either prevail on the battlefield or you die trying. And when we took on the Shia militia, many times we died trying because they were doing it better than we were doing it. That's just the nature of war. Yes, we shouldn't have been there, but just because we shouldn't have been there doesn't mean we get to rewrite the definition of what combatants are. We had insurgents who were legitimately opposing us. When we captured them, we treated them as prisoners of war. And when they killed us, they did so in legitimate combat operations. So I don't accept the notion that Qasem Soleimani has the blood of Americans on his hand. He doesn't. He was just a very effective, very lethal combat commander at a time of war.
One of the other things we never see emphasized in mainstream media is the role that Iran has played in defeating ISIS. Can you expound on that a little bit and just explain that to the audience?
In 2014, well, let's go even back further than that. In addition to the Shia insurgency that we confronted in Iraq, there was a big-time Sunni insurgency. Many of them were Saddam loyalists who were fighting in the tribal areas that were loyal to Saddam. Many of them were Sunni tribal elements that weren't loyal to Saddam, but were against the U.S. occupation, especially when the U.S. occupation began to align itself with a Shia-dominated government. So this insurgency took root. And, it's interesting. They say, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Initially, this insurgency was designed to be a Ba'athist resistance force. But after a while, it morphed into an Islamist-dominated force. This might have been intentional. Documents have been found where Saddam ordered his intelligence personnel to go into the tribes, to join the Islamic resistant groups, and to serve them well, and at the appropriate time to emerge to reimpose Ba'athist rule. So there's a big hand in glove connection between the Ba'athists and the Islamists. But that be what it may, we had a major Sunni insurgency that was quickly, aspects of it were hijacked by Al-Qaeda, what we call Al-Qaeda Iraq, AQI. This is Zarqawi and such. They're very effective, very deadly. They operated in areas around Baghdad and into western Iraq. We had thought we had defeated AQI, but what had happened with AQI is they simply disappeared into the villages, not only of Iraq, but across the desert into Syria, where because of an American-backed rebellion in Syria, large expanses of Syria were not governed. And so AQI moved into Syria to reorganize, renamed itself, rebranded itself the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, and in 2014 exploded onto the scene. Suddenly they're pouring across the border into Iraq, defeating the American-trained and equipped Iraqi army, which literally dropped its guns and fled, leaving tanks, jeeps, artillery pieces, even jet aircraft on the airfield, helicopters, for ISIS to take over. This was a complete rout and a complete collapse of the Iraqi army. ISIS actually moved down south of the city of Mosul, which is the second largest city in Iraq, towards Baghdad, and got into the outer suburbs of Baghdad. It looked for a while as if Baghdad could even fall to ISIS. The United States was powerless to do anything. We weren't prepared for this. We didn't have troops on the ground. We didn't have a relationship with the Iraqi government. We had nothing. The person that did have a relationship with the Iraqi government was Qasem Soleimani. And Qasem Soleimani came in. One of the things that happened in the collapse of the Iraqi army is a fatwa, a religious edict, calling upon all the youth of all the Shia youth of Iraq to mobilize, to go to Baghdad and fight to defend Baghdad against ISIS. And tens of thousands of Shia youth did this. But you can't send a ragtag bunch of kids into combat and expect them to prevail. Qasem Soleimani came in with his Quds force and began to organize these Shia youth into what's called the popular militia. And he organized them into effective combat forces, and then he directed them in combat against ISIS, fighting close quarter battles in village after village, bloody battles. Tens of thousands of these Shia youth were killed in combat, and they drove ISIS away from Baghdad and then back towards Mosul. Iraq was saved by Qasem Soleimani. And this is one of the reasons why he is so well loved, not only by the people of Iran who worship the man, but by the people of Iraq who recognize him as the savior who saved them from ISIS. And he doesn't get the credit, and Iran doesn't get the credit for defeating ISIS. The United States likes to pat ourselves on the back. We came in after the situation was stabilized. We brought in our air power, and we blew the place to hell to help the Iraqi military, defeat ISIS. And yes, ISIS was defeated, but the main power that defeated ISIS, the boots on the ground that held the ground afterwards, were these popular militia that were organized, trained, equipped, and led by Qasem Soleimani and the Quds Force.
It was in Erbil as well, where I lived for a couple of years, that the Iranians saved that city as well. They were 8 minutes outside of the city, ISIS. But you said that the U.S. wasn't prepared, and I wonder if that wasn't on purpose. And the reason I say that is because of this declassified August 2012 Defense Intelligence Agency document that talks about what you were just describing, where militants on both sides of the Iraqi and Syrian borders could join together and form Salafist principalities, and it could eventually lead to an Islamic State. That was the phrase used in the CIA document 2 years before anybody heard of, in the public anyway, Islamic State. And this was totally ignored by the U.S. administration. I want to bring Georgia back in here, but Scott, Can you just address that? Did the U.S. know that this was developing in August 2012, as they were warned by this DIA document?
Not only did we know, we actually actively encouraged it, because we never once believed that this Islamic State, as we called it, would turn towards Mosul and capture Mosul. We thought this would be a pathetic little bunch of Arabs out in the middle of the desert underneath their Bedouin tents, who would be harassing primarily the government of Bashar al-Assad, that they would be contributing to the destabilization of the Syrian government so that the so-called moderate rebel forces that we were arming and equipping could prevail in combat. That was the vision of this, that we would be hands off on these Islamists so long as they were focused against Assad. What we didn't predict was that they would turn west, capture Mosul, and then turn south and threaten to capture Baghdad.
That DIA document does say that they would be used to pressure Assad, and that the U.S. and the Gulf Arab states and Turkey were supporting them. What is interesting is also John Kerry, in that leaked conversation he had on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, I think it was 2015 or 16, he said to a group of Syrian exiles living in New York that we saw, meaning the U.S. saw ISIS advancing on Damascus, towards Damascus. We were hoping they'd get Assad to go away, but Russia came in and saved him. So in other words, they were risking, the U.S., according to Kerry's own words, he was Secretary of State at the time, the U.S. was risking ISIS actually taking over a major capital in the Middle East, Damascus. This is insane. Giorgio, can I bring you in, please?
When ISIS had its guns pointed west, the U.S. never had a good relationship with. That presented one set of circumstances. But when ISIS was a threat to the U.S.-backed government in Baghdad, different set of circumstances. So U.S. policy in terms of confronting ISIS was quite a bit different, depending on which side of the Iraqi-Syrian border we're looking at. When Trump made the decision to quote-unquote abandon the People's Protection Units, YPG, back in October, there was a lot of outrage in D.C. Many voices in the corporate-owned media, in my opinion, did quite a bit to exaggerate the YPG's role in the fight against ISIS. To be 100% clear, the YPG made very big sacrifices when it came to fighting ISIS, not trying to deny that at all. But again, the media narrative exaggerated that role nonetheless. And I agree with these points that when we look at the reporting of the past 24, 48 hours in many mainstream news platforms here in the U.S., there's very little critical analysis, intelligent discussion about the fact that when the U.S. was fighting ISIS, the interests of Washington and Soleimani were, at least in the short term, aligned, and the U.S. Air Force provided cover from up in the sky for a number of these Shia militias. I think what Donald Trump has tried to do since the so-called caliphate was destroyed is to try to turn attention toward Iran's influence in Iraq. And this is what we're seeing, with the strikes in December that struck Hezbollah brigades in 3 locations in Iraq and 2 in Syria, and more of this intensifying U.S.-Iran confrontation in Iraq. We're seeing this so-called maximum pressure policy play out. I think something we need to be concerned about is how Islamic State, which has not been entirely defeated in Iraq. Yes, the physical caliphate destroyed, but there are ISIS terror cells in the country. There are many marginalized Iraqis who still believe in the cause of ISIS, the spirit of ISIS. How the remnants of Islamic State will be able to capitalize on these new dynamics created by an intensification of U.S.-Iran confrontation in Iraq, like I said, is something that I think we should all be very concerned about at this point. It's always these extremist groups like ISIS that manage to do the best job of capitalizing on this kind of chaos.
I think it's clear that the war against ISIS in Syria is a completely different war than the one in Iraq. People tend to lump them together because in Iraq, the U.S. had a government they wanted to preserve, whereas in Syria, they had a government they wanted to overthrow. And also, one has to point out that if the U.S. did not want Iranian influence in Iraq, they would never have overthrown Saddam Hussein. They had to know this. It was folly on their part to think that they could contain Iranian influence in Iran. But let's move to a new topic, and Elizabeth, you can come in on this. The timing. Why now? What is going on? I have some ideas about this. I think it has something to do with domestic U.S. politics. But let's begin with you, Georgia, and then move to Scott and Elizabeth. Join in on this discussion, please.
It's a great question, and I have to be honest with you. I'm a little bit torn. Up until a couple of days ago, I was saying that when we look at Donald Trump, for all his flaws, for all the racism and everything else that we can legitimately criticize him for, I am grateful that it seems that we have a president who has stood against figures such as John Bolton, who were pushing for a war with Iran. And I didn't think that this was because Donald Trump was, committed to promoting stability in the Middle East or cared about the survival of Iranians. I viewed it cynically. He just simply wanted a second term. And I thought that Trump really understood popular opinion in American swing states, which is absolutely against getting bogged down in a new Middle Eastern war that brings thousands and costs trillions of dollars. At this point, though, I have to ask myself if Donald Trump's commitment that he made as a candidate on the campaign trail back in 2015, 2016, when he talked about ending this tradition of getting the U.S. bogged down in Middle Eastern wars, I have to ask, is that possible? There were figures from the Obama administration on the networks yesterday who were saying that we are at war with Iran as a consequence of this brazen assassination near the Baghdad airport. Iran at this point has no choice but to respond. The question is, where are they going to respond? When are they going to respond? We simply don't know. But it's an extremely safe bet that there will be a response from Tehran. They can't just accept a killing of their top commander. This would be like killing General MacArthur in the 1950s and thinking that the Americans aren't going to respond. So my concern is that once the Iranians do something nasty to retaliate, it's going to leave the Trump administration concluding that it can only have credibility if it responds to that. And this can escalate very, very quickly to a situation even much worse than what we have today. At the same time, there's all this talk about this ongoing impeachment saga and, Trump's wanting to sort of rally people behind the red, white, and blue. And I think there's probably something to that. But there's also another regional factor that I think should be brought up. As we recall, back in September, there were the missile and drone attacks on the Saudi Aramco oil infrastructure. And there was a lot of disappointment in some Arabian Peninsula capitals about what many in this part of the region perceived to be the lack of a U.S. response. Trump deployed more troops to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but there was not a major response directed against Tehran. And so I think it's possible that what we need to do is interpret this assassination within the context of Trump doing what he thinks he has to do to reestablish some sort of deterrence vis-a-vis Iran. Where this is going to lead, I don't think is going to be to Iran capitulating to the U.S. I don't think it's going to pan out that way. But we're trying to see maybe how Trump is looking at the situation. I think this issue of trying to reestablish some sort of deterrence is probably a part of his thinking.
That's a really interesting point. Scott, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree fully. I'll even back it up further than that. Look, Donald Trump, I believe, was sincere when he ran for president. He said, I don't want another war in the Middle East. I want to avoid a conflict. But he has this contradictory policy objective of compelling Iran to give up its nuclear program. And he chose, the path he chose to do that was to withdraw from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and then impose this policy of maximum pressure on Iran. It was supposed to be an economic program designed to pressure Iran through sanctions into coming to the negotiating table. And this began almost immediately in May of 2018. The problem is that the Iranians didn't play by Donald Trump's rules. Right off the bat, the Iranian government said, if you impose sanctions on us, that's economic warfare, which means it's warfare. Donald Trump, if you recall, sent out a tweet in all capital letters threatening the Iranians. Don't you dare say anything about me. I'm Donald Trump. I'm bad. And Soleimani responded in a speech where he said, I remind you that we're masters of asymmetrical warfare. You may start a war with Iran, but we're going to finish it and we're going to win it. You're in my playground now. Donald Trump is such a weak individual that when you insult him like this, he takes it personally and he can't let go. And I think that was the beginning of what we see today. And it's a desire to humiliate Iran now because he's been humiliated. He tried to play tough guy, by imposing more sanctions, but Soleimani outsmarted him. Mr. Asymmetrical Warfare actually waged asymmetrical warfare. There were a series of attacks on tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. Nobody knows who did it, but everybody knows who did it. Okay, it was a clear signal sent by Iran that we own the Strait of Hormuz. We don't have to deploy a navy into the strait. We'll just sink your ships, and we can do this any time we want. We tried to play tougher guy with them, and they shot down a drone, saying the signal that we can do this at will if you want. And each time they forced the United States to come face to face with the reality that in order to retaliate against Iran, you had to be willing to escalate the full-scale combat. And this entire time, Trump was being told, you can't do that because the Iranians are prepared to wage massive attacks throughout the region that will cause great harm. And when Trump said, well, who's the mastermind of all this? They said Qasem Soleimani. And the final straw, I believe, is when the Iranians facilitated the Houthi drone attack on the Saudi oil facilities. That was the ultimate sign of American impotence because in one fell swoop, the Iranians, through their Houthi proxies, demonstrated that they can shut down Middle East oil production at will. And that will destroy the global economy and Donald Trump's great economic revival. And that's when I think John Bolton, because one of the interesting things is Bolton said this has been in the works for a while. And I think that was the trigger. I think when Donald Trump came face to face with reality that Qasem Soleimani could wage asymmetrical warfare better than the United States could wage warfare, then he decided that Qasem Soleimani had to die. Now the question comes, when and where do you get him? Another interesting thing that's coming out right now is Israel was thanked for their role. What role? Now, a lot of people speculate, well, that meant that it was Israeli drones over Baghdad. No, it wasn't Israeli drones over Baghdad. It was American drones over Baghdad. American drones are always over Baghdad. People said, how can the Americans respond so fast? They're always there. Remember when the demonstrators were breaking into the American embassy? There were drones overhead. If they ever truly threatened the Marines, they would have all died instantly. That's just the reality of the situation. The drones are always up. They're always ready. They're ready to go, but you need intelligence. What we do know is that Qasem Soleimani was in Beirut, coordinating with Hezbollah on how to deal with the unrest in Lebanon. Then he traveled to Damascus, where he met with the Syrian government to talk about possible contingency operations against American forces in Syria should the situation deteriorate. Then he flew into Baghdad, where he was met by these senior PMF people, ostensibly to coordinate with them on how to deal with the Americans. Now this, in addition to the contingency operations on how do we respond militarily, in true Qasem Soleimani fashion, it seemed that he was prepared to deal with this politically, that his solution for the American problem was to work with the Iraqi parliament to get a vote to evict the Americans from Iraq. The Israelis, historically, we know that the Israelis have proven them able to track Soleimani in both Beirut and Damascus. We know for a fact when they assassinated the Hezbollah commander in Damascus that they actually had to hold off because he had just met with Soleimani, and the Israelis said, we can get them both. And then the U.S. said, no, we don't want you to get both. And they had to wait till Soleimani disengaged. But the Israelis are very good at tracking. And my guess in reading the tea leaves is that the Israelis detected Soleimani's presence and was tracking him. And we got on an aircraft to fly to Iraq. They passed that information to the United States, who put drones up. And when Soleimani got off, the drone feed went in, looked, confirmed it was him, got him in the car, tracked the car, and assassinated him. So, this was both what Bolton said is right. This is a mission a long time in the planning, but it was also a mission that requires taking advantage of immediate intelligence. And so both are true. And what this tells me is that this has nothing to do with impeachment. I don't think Donald Trump's worried about impeachment. There's not a snowball's chance in hell that the Senate's going to vote to convict. He knows it's not a threat. So he's actually thrilled with this impeachment process right now because it makes Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats look stupid and foolish. Numbers are going up. So I think those are two separate tracks. I think what's going on with Soleimani is that Soleimani embarrassed him. Trump was told by his advisors that we don't have a response to asymmetrical warfare. Soleimani was linked to asymmetrical warfare, and Trump is in his simplistic mind thought that if he could kill Soleimani, we could somehow overcome Iran's asymmetrical warfare. That's not true. The Quds Force, like any other good military organization, is like a bucket of water with your fist in it. When you pull your fist out, what size hole do you leave? None. Soleimani's death, as tragic as it is, isn't going to stop the Quds Force one bit. These guys are resilient. They're a military organization. Soleimani's had decades to train his lieutenants. The people who have taken over are fully prepared to do this mission, and they will do it with a vengeance. We haven't stopped anything. If anything, we've redoubled their determination to prevail in any future conflict with the United States. And I believe that this conflict won't be what people are thinking. Everybody's saying, well, is there going to be a big missile attack? Are they going to? No. Iran, with Qasem Soleimani in charge, always advocated against the stand-up fight with America because they know that once you go down that path, they're going to get hit with 500 cruise missiles a night for 3 weeks straight, that their infrastructure is going to be devastated. And while the United States may not win, Iran's going to lose because everything they've fought to build over the last 20 years is going to be destroyed. That's the last result Iran wants. They want America out of the Middle East. And thanks to the United States assassinating Soleimani, America's about to be ordered out of Iraq by the Iraqi parliament. And I believe the Iranians are preparing for the eventuality where America tells Iraq to pound sand. They say, we're not leaving. But at that point in time, every American in Iraq becomes free game, not for the Iranians, but for the Iraqis, whom the Iranians are going to be supporting. And that's how Iran's going to launch their decisive blow against the United States. The Iranians are strategic thinkers. They're not fools. They're not impetuous. These are people who know where they want to go and how they want to get there, and they're not going to let a foolish act by Donald Trump disrupt their plans.
Am I understanding you correctly if I say that this is, you're saying, in your opinion, you're saying that this really does originate with the Trump administration, with reneging on the Iran deal and that type of context? Is it more long-standing than that? Is this moment a much longer trajectory that we've been watching for years, or is it really just in the Trump administration?
The fact of the matter is both the administrations of President George W. Bush and Barack Obama had an opportunity to kill Qasem Soleimani. He's been a marked man for some time. And both those administrations refused to pull the trigger because they recognize what a destabilizing act is. And more importantly, both those administrations had Iranian experts who actually interfaced with Iran and understood one of the greatest realities that's missed in this entire discussion, that the single most powerful proponent for peace in the Middle East, for nonviolent resolution of disputes with the United States, was Qasem Soleimani. This is the man that whispered in the ear of the Iranian leadership every time they were confronted by the hardliners who said, we need to be more violent, we need to be more proactive. Qasem Soleimani is the man who said, we need to be patient, there's other ways to do this. He was the master of the other way. And that became a reality when Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal, thought he was engaged in an economic war, and found out he was actually fighting an asymmetrical war that the United States wasn't prepared to wage.
Scott and Giorgio, we talked, I think you may have been, both of you or one of you were on the show when we, after the attack on the Saudi oil installations, and it looked at that time that the U.S. realized that they cannot really respond because they were afraid of this all-out war or this type of consequence that Scott just described. So something has changed here. That's what I don't get. Why now did they decide to take this incredibly destabilizing act, as Scott pointed out? Why did they do this? And there's one other thing that I think we should look at in terms of the origin of this. Was I just looked up the date. It was April 2019. This administration designated the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. I recall, I believe, that coming up years ago in the UN, and many people were discussing you cannot designate a part of a national army as a terrorist organization. It's just legally absurd because they are not non-state actors, as terrorists generally are considered to be. But that, I think, maybe has some role to play here in terms of their legal justification that I think is bogus, and we can get into that. The assassinations was, the law is still on the books that came in the wake of the Church Committee in the 70s, in the Ford administration. They passed, there was a law that the U.S. could not assassinate people. It's still on the books, but it's been eroded to the point where it's meaningless right now. So, George, just wanted to talk a little bit about the legal background of this, and also why did the U.S. now decide that they could take this extremely destabilizing act when they realized before, even as recent as the attack on the Saudi installations, they did not.
You know, it was back in 2007 when this idea of designating IRGC as a terrorist organization came up. The U.S. government did not make that move, but you're absolutely right that for years there's been talk about doing this, and there's been a debate about the pros and cons of making this designation. I think obviously the United States has problems with what the IRGC is doing in the region, that's for sure. But the IRGC is a part of the Iranian state. Therefore, we have a problem. We, the Americans, have a problem with the Iranian state. As you mentioned, a terrorist organization is by definition a non-state actor. So back in April, when the U.S. made this move on the IRGC, I warned that this is creating very dangerous conditions, and this is not a good way for the United States to deal with the problems that it has with the IRGC. I think I want to add two more points, though, in response to your question about the timing. You know, this is an election year, and I think many of Trump's supporters are trying to draw some sort of parallel to the killing of Osama bin Laden. Trump wants to be able to claim a major foreign policy achievement. It's 2020. This is an election year, so that makes sense on one level. At the same time, let's be frank, maximum pressure is not achieving its goals. I mean, if the only goal of maximum pressure was to make life really difficult for Iranians, such as cancer patients in Iran, well, then it's achieved its goals. But maximum pressure was intended to get Iran to cut its links to the Houthi rebellion in Yemen, to cut off Lebanese Hezbollah, to cut off ties with certain non-state actors in Iraq that the Islamic Republic supports, to get Iran to completely abandon its nuclear program. I mean, none of that is happening. When we look at Iran's nuclear program, the Iranian leadership has they've been very open and transparent about this. They say as long as these sanctions keep on strangling our country, we're going to gradually step back from our commitments to the JCPOA. And for people who are genuinely concerned about the possibility, and I want to stress the word carefully, possibility of Iran developing a nuclear weapon, well, they have a lot more to be concerned about today than they did before the United States unilaterally pulled out of JCPOA back in 2018. Again, regarding Iran's activities in the region, I mean, there is no sign that maximum pressure has gotten Tehran to start behaving as Washington sees as good behavior. So I think the Trump administration has pushed itself into a little bit of a corner after the maximum pressure has been, and really from the standpoint of desperation that you see the U.S. really intensifying its confrontation with Iran on Iraqi soil. And as I've said, I think there's going to be a lot of blowback. I've been speaking to some people in the Arab Gulf states, voicing some very grave concerns about what's going to come next. The Iranian response, I don't think it's going to be on Iranian soil. It's going to be in another country, and this leaves everyone in the region, people in Afghanistan, people in GCC countries, people in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, very, very nervous about what comes next.
On social media, we've seen the proliferation of hashtags like World War III and that kind of thing. And I wanted to ask you both to give some perspective on how likely it is that this will turn into a major conflict, whether Russia and China would be willing to step in if the United States did actually declare war on Iran. How likely is it that they'll outright declare war on Iran? I'd like to hear your thoughts on all of those things.
Shortly before this recent escalation of violent chaos, there's a naval exercises that Iran carried out with Russia and China. And I think right now the variables of Moscow and Beijing really matter a lot. I think the Russian and Chinese leadership are trying to carefully assess what's going on. They are trying to look at all the risks and the benefits that could come from various moves to help Iran feel backed up by these other powers. And it's very clear to me that this is Iran's strategy, is turning to China and Russia for some more backing on the global level. At the same time, let's be clear, Russia and China have their own interests, and the Iranians are not naive about that. Something that has created a degree of tension between Tehran and Moscow has to do with, I don't think so much American military strikes on Iranian-backed groups in Iraq, but Israeli attacks on Iranian-backed groups in the region, mainly in Syria and also in Iraq. In Iran, there is a perception that the Russians have sort of sat by and let the Israelis carry out these attacks. A little bit of a feeling that Russia has not stood by Iran as much as officials in Tehran would have liked. Obviously, this is different. This is involving the U.S. military taking this action, new set of circumstances. But I just want to say it's going to be really important to see the extent to which Moscow and Beijing come to support Iran at this point.
Scott, you want to weigh in on that issue of Russia and China?
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. The naval exercises that just took place are a major event that I think has largely been ignored by the West. As we speak, Russian ships are berthed in the Chabahar port facility, naval base in Iran. I don't know where the Chinese frigate is right now, but if the United States were to attack Chabahar, they'd be sinking Russian ships. That's not what they want to be doing. And I think, I don't believe that Iran, Russia, and China are looking for a stand-up fight with the United States. I don't believe the United States is looking for a stand-up fight with Iran. The problem is, thanks to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, we've started the ball rolling down a path that we haven't done the reconnaissance on. We don't know where the dips are, where the bumps are, where the curves are. There's no guarantee this ball is going to stay on the path. The other thing is once you start a fight with the enemy, it doesn't matter what your plans are. The enemy always gets a vote. No plan survives initial contact with the enemy. The second you cross the forward line of departure, throw the plan away because your up is. There was once upon a time in the United States, we actually had departments staffed with experts who met on a regular basis to discuss policy options, to discuss what happens if X occurs, what happens if Y occurs. Have we coordinated with our allies? Have we reached out to the Russians to make sure that they're not going to overreact? And all of this has been thought out so that once you initiate an action, when things happen, you probably have somebody in there who says, hey, yeah, we thought about that. Here's the contingency. What Trump has done is eliminate that. We don't have any Iranian experts anymore. They've all been relieved or retired. What we've brought in a bunch of sycophants, a bunch of yes people whose sole job is to tell the president, yes, sir, whatever you want, sir. And that's also migrated to the military. With the demise of James Mattis, I don't think the military anymore is staffed with leaders who are willing to stand up to Donald Trump and tell him this is really, really bad policy. Because if they did exist, they would have told Donald Trump, this is really, really bad policy. Somebody in the Pentagon briefed the president and told him this was a good idea. And that's the scariest thing, because the Pentagon knows for a fact that if we get in a fight with Iran, we're going to win 5 years from now. But the cost we're going to pay in the meantime is going to be heavy, especially in those initial 6 months where we simply don't have the combat power. You know, the American people are fools. If we take a look at the deployment of the Fast Battalion out of 82nd Airborne, 750 American soldiers running to Kuwait, that's nothing. They can't do anything. They arrive in Kuwait, and so what? What are they going to do? They don't have heavy weapons. It's a bunch of light infantrymen. They get a parachute into Baghdad. If the Iranians and the Iraqis wanted to shut down the airspace around Baghdad, they would do so. Now, their single American helicopter would fly, which means that the green zone, the embassy, becomes the Alamo. This is the reality, and real military experts know this. We could bring in 4,000 paratroopers. That's nothing. You can't invade Iraq with 4,000 light infantrymen. Where's the heavy brigades? They're not there anymore. We got one. Half of it's in Syria as we speak because of Donald Trump's other lunatic thing. We don't have the military forces in the region to prevail. Yes, we have a lot of aircraft. Yes, we have a lot of bombs. Yes, we have a lot of cruise missiles. You know, the aircraft have to be based somewhere. And all of the bases in the region are vulnerable to Iranian missile attack. The cruise missiles have to come off ships. All of the ships are vulnerable to Iranian missile attack. This is one of the things that the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the new Commandant who came in, wrote a paper, and he said, we can no longer be married to the traditional way of doing business. We used to jam a bunch of Marines into 3 amphibious ships and sail them off to enemy shores and say, we're going to do a traditional beach landing. The ships won't even get there anymore. They'll be sunk halfway there by standoff missiles, and the Iranians have those standoff missiles. So, yes, we would win a war with Iran. There's no doubt about it. But what would the price be? And politically, could an American president survive when that price became apparent? It used to be a time when the military would stand up to the president and give him that reality. Something has failed. Somehow this president got briefed that killing Qasem Soleimani was a good idea, and he went along with it. So there's an abject failure. Is it with the CIA? Is it with the Pentagon? Is it with both? Is it the fact that we don't have a functioning National Security Council anymore? That we have national security advisors that are more attuned to stroking the president's ego than actually standing up for American national security? I don't know what the answer is. What I do know is that the American way of doing business has failed abysmally. And the end result is this disaster that has taken place in Iraq.
Well, one would think that Mattis would have a kind of respect for Soleimani. Military men, you know more than I do, Scott, obviously, but even your deadliest enemy, you could respect his military tactics, his strategy, his intelligence. Instead, as we heard from Giorgio, they're sort of comparing him to Osama bin Laden or to al-Baghdadi as another scalp, a terrorist scalp. And that goes back again to the legal aspects of this, because as I was just finding out here, in 75, when the assassination law ban came in, Carter administration respected it. But very soon, the Reagan administration started arguing that when it comes to terrorists, it doesn't apply. It's only to state officials that we cannot assassinate. So therefore, you make, again, the Revolutionary Guards a terrorist organization. Hence, Soleimani is a terrorist. Hence, we can get around this assassination ban and kill him because he's just like bin Laden. But that's absurd that he be compared with a terrorist as much as you might be his enemy. Isn't that right, Scott? Wouldn't somebody like Mattis respect Soleimani, would not think of him as a terrorist, or am I wrong?
You're right and you're wrong. You're right in terms of professional respect. A warrior respects a warrior. From, I think, 2007 on, America's top secret commandos, the Joint Special Operations Command, was engaged in a war in the shadows against the Quds Force in Iraq. And it was a frustrating war for these American commandos, who are the elite of the elite. But if you talk to the guys who waged that conflict, well, they'd say, yeah, we want to kill these guys. They had a begrudging respect for them because they were a worthy adversary who were very good at what they did. It's the same thing with the Marines in Western Iraq and Ramadi when we were fighting the remnants of the Special Republican Guard there. Every Marine who fought them wanted to kill them all, hated them, wanted to hunt them down and kill them. But when you get them in a bar with a beer, they said, man, those guys can fight. Those are worthy opponents. Those are warriors. We respect them as warriors. Yes, so Qasem Soleimani was well respected as a warrior. The problem is the politics, because we call him a terrorist because we've labeled the IRGC as a terrorist organization. So politically speaking, it's very difficult to say, yeah, I got a lot of respect for this guy, but he's a terrorist. Well, now you're in an administration where you got to watch what you say. And so, even the begrudging respect that people have for professionals, it's dissipated by the politics of demonization.
Giorgio.
Yes, I definitely agree with everything Scott has said. Trump is totally changing the lines here. The U.S. and Iran have had problems going back to 1979. Then, of course, after 2003, we saw U.S. and Iran competing for influence in post-Saddam Hussein Iraq. These problems continued throughout the Obama presidency, but there were unwritten but also understood lines that were pretty much established, and Trump has completely disregarded them. I agree that Trump, having himself surrounded by yes men, Trump's own insecurities, his own interests in erasing the legacy or making irrelevant the legacy of his predecessor, is a very important factor that has brought us into many of these problems that we've been discussing in this program. I have to wonder, though, if the United States is going to have a new president, perhaps begin his or her term in January 2021, and has to pick up the pieces. Where will that president go? This damage to the United States' reputation. I don't want to pretend like the U.S. had a pristine reputation in the Middle East before Trump began, but there's been damage to what goodwill the United States did have in the region. This damage is not going to heal as soon as Trump exits the Oval Office. Many of these problems are going to carry on throughout future administrations. Much of this mess in Iraq is a consequence of decisions that were made in Washington back in 2002, 2003, and we're still dealing with the blowback. I just think it could be a very, very long time that the U.S. and our allies spend dealing with the unintended consequences of this decision to take out such an important figure in the IRGC while he was on an official visit to Baghdad late last month. How Iraq is going to be impacted by this. This is a nightmare scenario for the government in Baghdad, which has tried so hard to be an ally of Washington, as well as a good neighbor and an ally of Tehran too. As I mentioned before Trump, there were certain lines when it came to the U.S.-Iran interaction in Iraq. And now that Trump has disregarded those lines, Baghdad is in a very, very difficult position. I think that Iran's government right now has a lot more leverage that it can use when it tells Iraq what it needs to do vis-a-vis the United States. There's going to be a lot more pressure coming down on Baghdad to distance itself from the United States. And I'll end this comment by just saying that I think in a very short period of time, just this month so far, January 2020, and also last month, December 2019, the US has lost a lot of influence in its relationship with Baghdad. US has gone about dealing with these Iranian-backed groups in ways that humiliates the government in Baghdad, makes Iraqi officials feel that the Americans have no respect for Iraqi sovereignty, makes them feel as though the Americans believe that the Iraqi government is just sort of an irrelevant player when it comes to these kinds of actions, bombing the group without receiving the permission of the Iraqi government. I predict that what Trump has been doing these past few weeks is going to bring Iraq closer to its Persian neighbor.
And as Scott pointed out, the Iraqi parliament could very well vote to have the U.S. leave, to expel the forces from. What happens then, Giorgio, if there is a standoff, as Scott said, if the U.S. says we're not going to leave?
Again, that puts Baghdad in a very, very difficult position. Again, the Iraqis have been trying hard to have good relations with both Washington and Tehran. It's not going to be possible under those kinds of circumstances. Iraq is going to have to pick. I think that that will inevitably create a lot of friction between Washington and Baghdad that could play out in many, many ways. But let's be clear, no American, as a civilian, a contractor, a diplomat, no one with U.S. citizenship will be safe in Iraq.
Well, I wish people in the administration would watch this show. They might learn a few things. It seems like they don't know a damn thing about.
I won't count on that, though.
No, seriously. So, I mean, could the Iraqis, with the Iranian support, actually fight the United States to get them out? I mean, but it could have come to that.
I don't think Iraq wants to go down that route. I think the Iraqis would really like to avoid that. But again, Iraq's government doesn't have too many options, let alone good options here. And this situation with Iraq being a real victim of the conditions created by intensifying U.S.-Iran brinkmanship is going to have to be some very, very difficult decisions that Iraqi officials make in 2020 when it comes to what kind of relationship they want with the U.S., what kind of relationship they want with the Islamic Republic. But remember, Iran is always going to be Iraq's neighbor. Whatever the Iraqis think about Iran and its government and its people, everyone in Iraq knows that Iran is always going to be in the region. The United States isn't always going to be in the region, and I think we need to keep that in mind when we're trying to look at this from an Iraqi standpoint.
I don't know. John McCain said it would be a 1,000-year war in Iraq, I think. And he may be right about that.
Iran will be there longer than that, though.
What about the Saudis now? I haven't heard anything, their official reaction. Maybe they've made one. Have you plugged into what they're saying?
So I think that if this took place prior to the Aramco tax of September 2019, we could have possibly seen a Saudi response that would have been very pro-Trump, very supportive of the U.S. action. But I think after those unprecedented attacks, this is more cautious. You're seeing not a change in the Saudi perspective on Iran. The Saudis still see Iran as a predatory state. They still view Iran as a grave threat. But it seems to me that since the Aramco attacks, the leadership in Riyadh has revisited its strategies for dealing with Iran because those attacks underscored the extent to which Iran has the means to impose incredible damage on the Saudi economy that would make Mohammed bin Salman's vision of diversifying the economy away from oil, known as Vision 2030, completely unrealistic. And I have to assume that while Riyadh wants to stand by Washington, in the Saudi government, I have to assume there are many officials who are very, very nervous about what comes next. And I think this is also something that could be said about the leadership in Abu Dhabi and other Arabian Peninsula cities as well.
Question I asked earlier about, basically social media reaction, World War III, and that, all of that, because I, as a member of the public that is watching these developments unfold and is concerned about what might come next, I'd really like to get your insight into what you think is the most likely scenario in the next, few weeks, few months. Because I think that I'd like to know if the public really is, if their concern is warranted that this could really lead to something horrific, or whether it's kind of going to be, maybe heightened tension, but business as usual. I think I'd like to know where you think the situation stands on that front. Scott.
Well, again, no plan survives initial contact with the enemy. I hate to be trite, but that's just a reality. We've opened up a Pandora's box here. We literally don't know what we want. We don't know what our policy objectives are. I mean, killing Qasem Soleimani appears to have been an end, a means to an end, but we don't know what the end is. It hasn't furthered a positive trend in American-Iranian relations. It hasn't brought the United States closer to Baghdad, but it hasn't diminished the capacity of the Quds Force to carry out the alleged contingency operations that Qasem Soleimani was playing. All it's done is really pissed off a lot of people. And I apologize for my language. But the fact of the matter is, we're in a situation now where the United States doesn't know what it wants to accomplish. Iran does. Iran knows exactly what it wants to accomplish. And it wants to get the United States out of Iraq. That's their goal. That's their objective. And the Iranians are mature enough as a nation, as a government, not to allow themselves to be distracted by this horrific event. There's going to be 3 days of mourning. Qasem Soleimani is going to become a martyr that's going to unify Iran and unify the Shia of Iraq and bring them together. To what end? To remove the United States from Iraq. That's what's going to happen. Now, how the United States reacts to this reality is different. The United States, some things have happened recently that we didn't talk about. Do you remember the massive anti-Iranian demonstrations in Baghdad? Do you honestly think those were spontaneous expressions of emotion, a legitimate emotion from the Iraqi people? Or do you think for a second that maybe the United States, over the course of nearly 2 decades, has seeded enough money and influence that we can generate that kind of response and egg it on? It failed. It failed to move the barometer. Yeah, there was a lot of social media pictures, a lot of violence, a lot of people died. But at the end of the day, it didn't change the reality that Iran dominates Iraq. We did the same thing. The gasoline revolt in Iran, street demonstrations. Well, the Iranians just shut down the internet. As a result, all that carefully planned social media activism didn't happen. And where is it today? Gone. Lebanon, WhatsApp. People get up in the street. You can't tax our internet app. The United States moves in, brings in its money, starts paying people off. Trump has been sold a bill of goods by his advisors who are telling him that there exists in the Middle East today a strong bastion of pro-American sentiment that can be tapped into. There is no pro-American sentiment in the Middle East today. There are people who accept the American reality and accept the American dollar and use America as a bulwark of defense. But there's not a single Middle East nation today that views the United States as a force of stability. And as the United States power diminishes, people are going to start to break away. We talk about Saudi Arabia. There's something else going on besides Aramco. It's a little problem called Yemen and the Houthi. It doesn't take Iran to turn the Houthi into an effective fighting force. They were an effective fighting force, before they got this close relationship with the Iranians. The Houthi are winning the ground war. As we speak today, Houthi troops are occupying Saudi territory. And if they consolidate their position, they could advance and take more territory. There's a good chance Saudi Arabia may lose its southern provinces, which historically belonged to Yemen to begin with. This is what the Saudis are worried about, because if you start peeling off those provinces, then the Shia provinces and the eastern provinces will start getting the unrest, and that's the end of the Saudi nation. That's their true fear. They're very worried about this. And one of the things that could trigger that is if Iran shuts down Saudi oil production, because without oil, Saudi Arabia is nothing, literally nothing. They're a bunch of pathetic Wahhabists who bought off a pathetic family of Bedouins who have brought nothing positive to either their country or the world. They'll go away. They're very nervous. That's why they're sort of silent. The Iraqis, when they tell the United States to leave and the United States says no, what's going to happen? Is the Iraqi military going to rise up and move? No. But what they are going to do is move away from the Americans, isolate the Americans. Now the Americans are going to be sitting ducks for the various militias that are going to be controlled by Iran. And the question is, how does the United States react to that? It's imperative that Iran doesn't do something foolish and create an Alamo. We have 150 Marines fight to the death, overrun and massacred. Because there's no better way to mobilize the American sentiment for a long-lasting bloody war against Iran than to do that. But if you pick us off one by one, 5 at a time, 10 at a time, and make it appear that we're impotent, that we can't respond, the American people get tired of that really quick. And then the political pressure is going to come on to withdraw. Can Trump handle that? Or is he going to be tempted to blame Iran and take it out on Iran and attack Iran? These are the unknowns. As I said, we opened up a Pandora's box. We don't know how this is going to end. This could end, it's going to end badly no matter what for the United States. We're out of the region. We've lost the Middle East. The question is how long it's going to take for us to realize that and what price we're going to pay and what price we're going to make others pay before that happens.
Scott, I'm tempted to let you have that last word, but I'll give it to Giorgio to end this segment.
Well, thank you very much. Absolutely true that we have opened a Pandora's box and there are countless unknown variables. I'm not so sure that Iran is going to respond soon. Iran, based on understanding of Iran's modern history and the way that Iran has countered U.S. influence in the region, the Iranians are very patient. They're looking at this not sort of an American political cycle of every 2 years or 4 years with elections. Again, they're looking long-term. Iran doesn't feel the need to respond immediately. A response could come later, but what's clear is that there is going to be an Iranian response. And I'll throw it out there. This might not be a response that comes in a location that many analysts might be predicting right now. There are these hot spots in the Middle East where Iran is tied to some heavily armed groups. And yes, there could be reprisal there. But there's other regions of the world too where we could see a response. Southeast Asia. This is a crisis that is not necessarily going to be contained to the Middle East region. I don't know at this point what de-escalation looks like. Of course, I think the U.S. should be trying to find ways to de-escalate, but I just don't see a de-escalation happening anytime, at least with Donald Trump in the Oval Office, certainly during his first term. It's tough to imagine. I mean, maybe some sort of situation whereby the Trump administration tries to spin the narrative and say, U.S. military defeated ISIS in Iraq. We had a problem with Iranian activity, so we took out Soleimani, and now we're going to come home. Then Trump could tell his voters, his supporters who are going to vote for him, that he was able to wind down American military campaigns in the region. And then the Iranian leadership could spin this to say that they were able to create conditions in Iraq that pushed the Americans out. But I wouldn't bet the farm. I would not bet the farm on that happening in 2020. It seems difficult to imagine this brinkmanship cooling down or de-escalating. I'm very, very worried about what will come next. I think 2020 is going to be a very, very difficult year for Iraq as the U.S. administration continues with this anti-Iranian campaign of maximum pressure.
That was Middle East analyst Giorgio Cafiero in Washington area, and we were joined by Scott Ritter in Albany, New York. We want to thank both of you, Scott being a former UN weapons inspector in Iraq. It was brilliant, both of your comments, and we appreciate you joining us. You're watching CN Live.
Get out your notebook. There's more.